I find that American classrooms typically teach a very sentimental, nationalistic story about the September 11th attacks. In my research, I found that this generation of people who were born shortly after 9/11, they know very well that 2,977 Americans died that day. That first responders suffered respiratory illnesses that day. They don't know about the Abu Ghraib prison. They don't know about the reasons that were given for the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. In fact, 1 in 5 of my respondents believes that Saddam Hussein was somehow responsible for the 9/11 attacks. I'm Nazia Kazi, and I'm an anthropology professor at Stockton University in New Jersey. I live in Philadelphia, and my work focuses on Islamophobia and American foreign policy and American racism, and kind of the intersection between these. I think 9/11-2001 is one of those moments in America's collective memory where anyone who's old enough to remember the attacks remembers exactly where they were when they happened. But there's an added dimension for Muslims in the US, because not only do we remember where we were when the attacks happened, but we also remember this kind of sucker punch we felt that there was going to be backlash, that there was going to be sort of a collective backlash doled out on Muslims and those thought to be Muslim. Immediately after September 11, 2001, the US made the decision to invade Afghanistan. At the time, I was a college student. I really had to grapple with the realities of American militarism, which was everywhere. Once you start looking at American militarism, you don't stop seeing it. It is at Air Force flyovers at NFL games. It is at military recruiters on college campuses. Schools, right, have military recruiters. So American militarism became this undeniable reality after September 11th. And for me, over the years, it's been over a decade that I've been teaching college students, I've now seen, coming into my classes, generations of students who actually don't remember the attacks of September 11th. They have entirely grown up in these terror decades in the age of the US-led war on terror. For me, it's important to think about American Islamophobia in the light of the long-standing history of American racism. So for instance, yes, after September 11th, this Patriot Act was passed. Democrats liked it, Republicans liked it, and it was this sweeping set of laws that legalized all kinds of violations of Americans' civil liberties. But let's take the question of surveillance, for instance. If you see post-9/11 surveillance of Muslims as this bizarre, freakish, absurd, oppressive thing that happened after 9/11, you miss the history of racism in the US, right? Let's talk about how Native Americans have been surveilled. Obviously, African Americans have been surveilled relentlessly by the US state. And if you can see the surveillance of Muslims in that larger context, it starts to seem less like an anomaly and more foundational. That perhaps the persecution and surveillance of racial others is one of the things the US does and historically has done, and there are continuities there. So for me, teaching about 9/11 is really interesting, especially recently, because these young learners don't remember September 11th, 2001 at all. And one of my more recent research projects has been to study what it is these generations who are too young to remember 9/11 were taught about 9/11. My findings are really depressing to me, because I find that American classrooms typically teach a very sentimental, nationalistic story about the September 11th attacks. So for instance, in my research, I found that this generation of people who were born shortly after 9/11, they know very well that 2,977 Americans died that day. They know very well that first responders suffered respiratory illnesses that day. They don't know about the Abu Ghraib prison. They don't know about the reasons that were given for the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. In fact, 1 in 5 of my respondents believes that Saddam Hussein was somehow responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Because it shows me that the ways 9/11 has been taught have been serving, US empire. They have not been sober assessment of the historical events that unfolded, that led to it, and that followed. My respondents were not able to tell me what the Patriot Act was. My respondents largely are unfamiliar with Al-Qaeda or the US involvement in Afghanistan before 9/11. So there is this national amnesia around 9/11 that makes teaching about it particularly challenging, but also really important. They don't know that 37 million people have been displaced because of the war on terror. I mean, these numbers themselves can force a paradigm shift in anyone who's thinking carefully, in anyone who's thinking critically. And so I like to offer some of those narratives in my classroom. And these are the kinds of conversations I try to force in my classroom. This sort of uncomfortable sitting with the realities of the role that the US has played, US power on the world stage. This question of how far we've come as a critically conscious nation since 9/11 is one that frankly depresses me. You know, I talked about how my study of people's understandings of the war on terror reveal a deep ignorance about the events of 9/11 and what came before and what came after. But we would be wrong to think that that ignorance is because of an individual's lack of curiosity or an individual's, stupidity or something like that. That actually ignorance is systemic. I mean, there's a reason that there are no curricula about the US's role in arming and training the Mujahideen and how that led to 9/11. There's a reason for that. And I think, we have to be really careful in understanding that America's amnesia, right, or stupidity, or lack of memory about 9/11 and the war on terror is not the fault of any individual. It is the product of much larger systems. It's less a question of whether we've moved forward and more a question of whether we've moved backward as a country.